Good afternoon. My name is Chrissy Thornton, and I am the president and CEO of Associated Black Charities. And I would love to welcome all of you to today's Equity at Work webinar, where we will talk about DEI fatigue, addressing the backlash and sustaining momentum. Welcome. So, as we all know, DEI initiatives have made critical gains in recent years, especially since 2020, creating pathways for many professionals and many marginalized groups to thrive. However, the recent backlash, often referred to as DEI fatigue, threatens to undo much of this progress. Today's discussion will explore how that fatigue is showing up in workplace culture, what it means specifically for Black professionals, and how we can sustain the momentum despite the resistance to push forward. Our goal today is to empower individuals and organizations to push back strategically, to advocate for accountability, and to reaffirm that equity work is a core value. Equity cannot be dead because equity is vital. And today I have the wonderful pleasure of having two professionals with extreme expertise on this subject to join me today, and I'll ask both of them to join me on screen at this time. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today we have with us Dr. Malone and Ms. Berrien, and I would love nothing more than for each of them to have the opportunity not only to introduce themselves to those of you joining us today, but to talk to us about why this topic is so important to each of them. And we'll start with you, Dr. Malone.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Duvalier Malone. I am a senior lecturer of management at Coppin State University and the CEO of Duvalier Malone Enterprises. A lot of my dissertation research was centered around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the senior level ranks of government, and particularly the federal government, looking at the GS 14, 15, and SESers in government. And it's so amazing. Just a year ago, I finished up my PhD, and the topic was very relevant. A big push to get more minorities and more women of color in senior executive roles. And now we see an attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion and the removal of those. And so I believe that today this conversation is so relevant to really understand the nuances of diversity, equity, and inclusion and what it really means in the workplace and in our organizations, and at the core of the humanity of it all and the backdrop of how we got to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really kind of set the record straight as it relates to a lot of the weaponization of the terminology. So I hope that this conversation is an opportunity to educate, motivate, and inspire people to continue to engage in the broader conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion, even in the midst of these attacks. So thank you for having me this afternoon.
Thank you so much for being here. Ms. Berrien, love to hear from you. And make sure you come off mute.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. So I am Tara Berry, and I'm the Assistant Vice President for Diversity EEO here at Morgan State University. So my background is being a lawyer, but I went to law school in order to understand how the law affects society as well as policies. So doing that, so I was a litigator for a period of time, but then I'm a little bit too tenderhearted to be a litigator. So I am focused mostly on equity issues. And so that's been for over 20 years. And we have seen a resurgence of equity issues being at the forefront for a period of time. And then it's now starting to gently chip away. So I think that having these conversations is very important to get into the space of understanding what we mean when we say DEI, as opposed to just saying Black only or pro women. It is an equity issue as opposed to an equal issue. And then I also wanted to note that anti-discrimination and DEI are two totally different things. However, mostly from what you're hearing from the administration in Washington, it seems that they're marrying the two, and they are very separate and distinct. So I'd like us to talk about that as well.
Absolutely. And I see some people have already started to identify
Um,
themselves in the chat. We'd love for you to continue to do that. Feel free to exchange information or LinkedIn links so that you can stay connected. But also feel free to ask questions of our panelists today or to share your own lived experience with some of the conversation. Let's dive right in and talk about DEI fatigue. When people talk about DEI fatigue, I want to make clear that this predates the executive orders, right? 2020, some of these initiatives were put into place, and people were already starting to state and to feel the fatigue and to roll back the efforts and initiatives for a number of reasons. But now we have executive orders that have purported that DEI and those initiatives are divisive and un-American and discriminatory. Now the backlash is real. I heard in the news this morning that after the executive orders, of course, there were a number of federal agencies that were defunded or where the DEI initiatives were completely removed. Some preemptively removed them themselves. But what worried me the most was the conversation of how the private sector, many of whom do not have direct penalty that they're facing, just chose to kind of go with the flow on that. So I'd love to know what both of you, when you hear DEI fatigue, or when you think of rollback of DEI, what is happening and why is it happening? We'll start with either of you. Go ahead, Ms. Marion.
Did you? Oh, okay. So one thing that is happening is because I think people are fearful of the words, right? Just automatically. So at Morgan State, one of the core values is diversity. And the very first conversations we were having was, should we just remove diversity as one of our core values, right? No, absolutely not. Like it's embedded in us, right? So it is a matter of people just having the response that it's kind of scary. Let's just be frank. It's scary about what these executive orders are moving towards and chipping away at rights that are codified by the law and not able to be removed or backed off by some executive order. However, it's causing that kind of panic, which I think might be the intended purpose to wash away things that are promoting diversity and equity issues in search of pro-America and a certain look to what America should look like.
Dr. Malone?
I honestly think in order for us to talk about the fatigue, we also got to talk about how we got here. And so, how we got here, the data has presented itself to us over the course of a couple of decades now that women, in particularly in senior leadership roles, whether that's in the government space, corporate America, have been the least among us at the top levels of leadership. The data proves that. When we look at, in particularly African Americans in the federal government space, that is one of the reasons why we, inside of the federal government plays, a part of my research spoke to that of the presidential fellow scholars, the senior executive leadership programs that was there to help minority and particularly African Americans and women, and particularly, and not just African Americans, but women and women of all race, because they were a part of a generation that was not at the top of the level. The data shows us that, white men have dominated senior executive roles, and that is what the data spoke to. And so over time, we saw, as in any movement, that women, African Americans, and people started to advocate for their rights. And as a result of that, we had civil rights. And then as we've moved more into the modern era, we have phrased it as diversity, equity, and inclusion. But literally, it is giving every single person the opportunity to have a level playing field. And so when we think about DEI fatigue, sometimes I feel like the fatigue is coming from the opportunity of not messaging why we need these diverse voices at the table, right? So, for example, an organization who has taken a internal look at themselves and say, you know what? For the last 50 years, we've had all male leaders to be the CEO of this organization. It is time for us to position ourselves to bring in a qualified person outside of the norm. That comes the equity piece, right? Not giving someone not giving someone a position because of a particular race or background or gender, but just opening up the door to say we need to be self-aware that we need diversity, we need equity in that. And when we say diversity, we need people from all different backgrounds, walks of life. We need equity, making sure everybody has the same playing field, right? And we need inclusion, which means that everybody can be included in this process. And I think we have used these buzz terms as just buzzwords, but not really educating our workforce on what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean, right? The equity piece, making sure everybody has a level playing field. Diversity, bringing all different types of people in, and inclusion, and making sure that we are including everyone and messaging it to the fact that stakeholders are able to understand that.
Absolutely. And I agree with both of you that the terminology is really important, and a lot of people don't use it. And a lot of people probably can't define DEI if asked to, especially those in opposition of it. And those of us who are practitioners of the work are really compelling people to use the words, use the actual words, consider diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not this DEI model that's so easy to push away and so easy to roll back from. So now we are facing political narratives, economic pressures that are real for some organizations and workplaces. There was already resistance to change and do better and be better. And you'll hear me talk about how I feel DEI benefited or didn't benefit the Black community. But I will say that most of us will agree that this is a calculated rollback, right? Like, we're now comparing giving people equity to meritocracy. How do we feel about the narrative that's being painted about equity and inclusion in today's political landscape?
One of the things that I take issue with when we think about equity and inclusion is that if we really understand the dynamics of making sure that everyone has a clear playing field, right? When we look at our workforce, African American women or make up the top majority of terminal degrees in our country. And so the data speaks to that. They are some of the most highly qualified, but they still do not hold the ranks of senior executives and across private sector, across the nonprofit sector, and across the government sector. That is the data, right? And so one of the things that I do not like in this current environment is putting this diversity, equity, and inclusion as as a social promotion or as someone has been given a position when these particular individuals who are benefiting, some of them who are benefiting from the diversity, equity, and inclusion, are benefiting as a result of companies being more self-aware of that we need diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they are more than well qualified to be in those seats. And so we have to stop that narrative because all Black people, they are qualified to sit in those seats. But sometimes the narrative is switched as if someone has given us that. We have been the least beneficiary, and the data shows that when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives across organizations, we have benefited more from the rolling back of the civil rights agenda, the EEOCs being in place. More African Americans have benefited from that than they have benefited from these diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because in many instances, I always like to say this, they are buzzwords unless we have put them into action in organizations and we're self-aware of the ability that, number one, we need diverse individuals across our organization. We're self-aware of that. Number two, that we need equity, that everybody has the same playing field. And number three, that we are including the whole workforce. And many organizations' data shows different. We see that with the number of EEOC complaints. My colleague on the panel can probably speak to that. The data shows different. So in order for diversity, equity, and inclusion to work, all those components have to be working. And many organizations' data has been a reversal of that anyway. So the allusion to, if people follow the data tells a different story than this political weaponization that is being given to the public.
Mm-hmm. Both of you are at higher education institutions, and so I'd love for you to give that framework too. Ms. Berrien?
No, I was just going to say that this is where we want to start with the differences between DEI and civil rights, right? Like civil rights, anti-discrimination, that's the law. DEI is the practice of how you get to the law, right? And Dr. Malone is absolutely right. Like for the EEOC, it was put in place for all protected classes, including like race, gender, color, national origin, religion. However, the for at least the last 10 years, the most significant cases that they have taken on, or the complaints that have been successful, not just filed, but successful, were those that were based on pregnancy, gender, and sex. So similar to how civil rights laws are mostly benefited, and data shows, studies show this, that white women have benefited from that, not Blacks, not any other racial group, any other, or the other, and gender. So it has been white women. So with DEI, we're seeing the same thing, where it's benefiting Asian students, because if you think about the Harvard case, where the Supreme Court struck it down, that was about Asian students being able to progress through higher ed, right? But DEI is not a quota. It is opening the space, just like you were saying, like having an invitation to the dance. It is on that person to figure out if they want to stay and dance, if they dance well, who they want to dance with. It is based on their own merit. The DEI part is just opening the door to allow them to progress. It's not a quota thing. So it's similar to this. So while the federal government has indicated that there should be a breakdown, and all things DEI is bad, right? The state of Maryland still has the cultural diversity plan, right? It's required by the state for every institution, higher ed institution, to have some kind of cultural diversity plan. And it is more so of what are you putting in place to invite people to become part of your campus, not that you have to have X amount of women or X amount of Blacks or X amount of Asian students. So that is the difference that needs to also be educated about. Like, DEI is not about that quota part. And it has been mostly benefiting, just as civil rights laws have been benefiting white women, they've been benefiting, DEI is benefiting white people and white women. It's never been something for Blacks that have been advanced for Blacks. It hasn't been. Otherwise,
I'm glad you both, yeah, I'm so glad that you both brought that up. And it's one of the reasons why today doesn't seem very different than 3 months ago felt, or 6 months ago, or 30 years ago felt in the Black community specifically, because we have not been the beneficiaries, although it might seem like a lot of times these conversations are reduced to race. But we have not been the beneficiary. So while we're going to talk about what the rollback of DEI efforts and how they have affected Black professionals, I would say that Black professionals have sustained this harm all along, despite having DEI or now not having it. Some of the barriers listed in the research are fewer mentorship and leadership development opportunities, isolation in workplaces and lack of sponsorship, emotional exhaustion for fighting for basic justice and fairness in workplaces, loss of initiatives that will help our communities address wage gaps and access. Now, I saw in the comments we mentioned access and belonging, and all those things are important too. And it's one of the reasons why ABC focuses on equity, because we believe equity is the answer for our community. We knew DEI was not serving us. All of these ways that rolling back the efforts may harm Black professionals have continued to be harmed throughout the spectrum of the DEI movement and now beyond it. What do you think about that?
It's one of the reasons why we have African American sororities and fraternities. We always have to have had community outside of the corporate and professional space, right? And so, to your point, while these efforts are rolling back, may have some effect on Black people, it won't be as impactful as some may think. And I'll give you an example. When I did my dissertation research, I looked at all of the federal government programs that were to help individuals become a senior executive. They only was accepting 5% African Americans into that program every year. And out of the 5%, only 2% of those 5% were getting promoted to an SES. And if we look at the broader data, it affected, to my colleague's point here, it affected and supported white women being a beneficiary of that. But when I did my qualitative research and I talked to senior executives who indeed were Black women, they talked about how their sororities had their own internal leadership programs, how they were involved in programs within their churches and their communities, who gave them the tools and the success that they needed, the mentorship and guidance to get those skills that they needed outside of the workplace, right? So I think for Black people, we've always created spaces. We've all, like today, this is a space, right? We've always had those spaces outside because we've never really depended on some of these buzzwords of diversity, equity, inclusion, some of these programs. We were never the beneficiary of those programs. 2 to 5% is not a lot when you have over 72% or beneficiaries of, white women being a part of these programs. So we
Absolutely.
never really had a pipeline anyway.
Right. And I totally agree with you. The pipeline also has been more in the social setting with the employee resource groups that are starting to develop within the workplace. We are seeing more opportunities for individuals in the workspace. But yeah, it's always been socially with sororities and churches as well. But also there had been some going through getting grants, right? So doing some grant work, but I think that somebody in Washington just did a cut and paste of every grant that said diverse or diversity in it, because there's grants that are being pulled back, right, rolled back because of DEI or anti-DEI language that is not necessarily about DEI. Like there was one for, I can't think of the title right now, but the grant for having diverse color palettes within AI. So like, for instance, if anybody goes into the bathroom and has that automatic hand washer and it doesn't pick up your skin, or it doesn't pick up that your hands are there, it's because there's not a template or like there's no research around different skin tones. And in that grant, there was some language that said diverse skin tones, and they have rolled back that grant, like pulled that money back because it had the word diverse in it. So we are seeing that significant rollback in other areas, right? The courts, the grants. So it is important, particularly in the workspace, to start bringing what we have already in society and political, like the NCAA, or yeah, the NCAA.
NAACP.
The NCAA. I was already on a webinar for the NCAA. That's why. So then when you start having it in the workspace, it may have that same effect. But we've always had to reply on other things that are less formal to move forward the agendas, I put plural, of Black folks, because we're not like one group of people. It's very individualized.
Absolutely. And many companies are in haste rolling back their efforts, very easily, without a lot of consideration, without a lot of conversation among the stakeholders. They're just silently pulling back. And the understanding is that many of them are doing that when they don't even need to, right? Like these are not the beneficiaries of federal funding. These are not people who are in jeopardy of investigation or any kind of, big chaos that would ensue because they stood 10 toes down. And I think it's very telling. A lot of the people in the chat are describing their organizations, and I see words like disappointing, conceding, concerning. Also, I see resilient, where some organizations are going to stand in the work. I think as we look at DEI as a practice, for those organizations that are rushing to roll back, that don't have imminent threats to their funding, to their sustainability, what do we think about those organizations today?
I always say that we are the beneficiary of the lenses in which we see the world. And what I mean by that is, how we have came up, our lived experiences, how we grew up, what communities we grew up in, how we were raised, our religious backgrounds, all those different things, whether people want to believe it or not. People bring that to the table in their professional lives, their lived experiences, their lenses. And then many times people say, well, do we really need diverse voices? Yes, because many of these organizations who are rolling back these initiatives, they're rolling it back because they don't have the diversity of voices. They don't have those Black women sitting at the table to advocate for that as the CEOs. So the data is so clear, it's so relevant that we still see that a bunch of these CEOs, or they don't look like America. They don't have the makeup of diversity. If they had those diverse voices at the senior levels of leadership at these organizations, they wouldn't be so quick to move. And so I think their lived experiences, the way in which they view the world, this bros club that they are all a part of, is leading and is so evident in how quick they're being how quick they're moving. They're moving very quick, very swiftly, without even talking to their stakeholders. And any of us who know, when we teach business, we tell them the first thing you do is talk to your stakeholders. The first thing you do is survey your stakeholders, and they also feel empowered because, and whether we believe it or not, everything starts at the top and trickles down. Leadership starts at the top, and now they feel empowered and emboldened. And I think we, the people, we see that the stakeholders, we the people, are kicking back on that, and they're starting to reverse course.
Mm-hmm. Well, I
And
think
I
in
think
many cases, DEI was looked at as a value proposition, right? They were looking at how it could increase profit margins, how it could affect employee retention, how it could increase profitability and innovation, but not necessarily the impact it had on real people who were their employees or who were their customer base. And they're starting to, as we say, find out. Ms. Berrien?
No, and that's exactly what I was going to say. Like, it was more of so of a money decision when they started implementing it, right? Like, it was the cool thing, it was the buzzword at the time. And now that it's going back because of their lived experiences, they don't have, and also the lack of education. The fact that DEI is seen as a quota as opposed to just going off of merits and inviting everybody based on and letting them be successful based on their merit. They're seen as a quota. So that a quota is not good for profits when it comes down to it. So it is all about money. It was a buzzword and it was a great thing for a while, and now it's not. So let's just pull it off.
It was
Right.
also a funding model for many nonprofits, but we may have to talk about that later because many of you who are being defunded and you were a nonprofit organization and benefited from diversity funding should not have received it in the first place, but I digress. I'm gonna move on from that and we'll lay that down for another day. Dr. Malone?
No, I totally agree. I believe that, when you look at the model, it moves with, I always tell my students that whether we believe it or not, politics rules the day of anything. We have the politics of our organization. We have the politics of our nonprofit institutions, right? They're the cultures in which runs the organization. And so I believe that now the politics of the day is shifting, right? People and organizations are shifting. We also have to talk about, too, when we look at this administration and the tax breaks that they are going to give these companies, they are also doing the math, right? And so if we take a hit on one side of getting rid of DEI, will we gain on the other side from all of our tax breaks and all of our other benefits that this administration is going to give us? So, to my colleague's point, it is a numbers game, and they are filtering through their numbers. And if the model for their tax breaks is high, is the same, or they feel like they are breaking even, they don't care. Now, once they money go to messing up, and we see that with Target, for example, they're starting to have a conversation with themselves, right? So I do think that some of this was done very quickly, very swiftly, but I do think some companies are running their numbers and their projections, and they are basing it on some of the promised policies that this administration have also given these organizations and corporate firms.
Absolutely. And I think if you're an employee and you're in a workplace and you are shocked or taken aback at what you're perceiving as a rollback of equity initiatives in your organization, you should be asking yourself if it really was happening successfully in your organization in the first place. And here are some markers I want to share and then get your feedback on this. Was there executive buy-in, or is there executive buy-in? Equity, inclusion initiatives have to be a leadership responsibility. It's not something that's relegated to a HR or community relations function. It is a leadership responsibility. Were those equity outcomes tied into performance evaluations and the strategic goals of the organization? Did we provide transparent updates on the goals around equity? Were there progress reports? Were challenges discussed in transparency and mitigated? Was equity integrated into all major business decisions as a core component? Was it present in hiring, in promotions, in procurement, in the community partnerships? And were there the allowance of coalitions to be built within and across the organization? Was advocacy allowed in the organizations? So if those things weren't in place, then you are not experiencing a rollback of DEI. You did not have successful DEI in the first place. And I think that's what some of us have to come to terms with. Any thoughts?
Absolutely. I won't call the organization name, but I was just working on a research project on a nonprofit organization who, to your point, had received millions and millions of dollars in diversity, equity, and inclusion from all different firms, from the federal government, all the different spaces. And of course, I ran the number of their leadership. I ran the number of, their new hires, etc. It was not the makeup of our society. The data showed the same single thing that we see with these big organizations. We know who rules the day in these organizations, and it was not women, it was not Blacks. And so, to your end, was that really a success, right? Because if you're receiving this equity, to your point, should you all have even been receiving this money if it was not tied into performance plans, even to the end? And I'll end with this on this particular topic. Even the stakeholders that they were serving in the field, the people who needed the resources that this nonprofit was given, the makeup wasn't even diverse. I'll leave it there.
It really is.
So was there executive buy-in? The short answer is it depends. If you look at an organization and they have a diversity office or they have a chief diversity officer, it makes you pause at first to think that they are dedicated to DEI, but then you need to drill down to see where that person sits. If it's one person, if they are responsible for all things DEI, or if they are like part of a committee or there's more than just one person or one office that is committed to that. Also look at the language that you see that individuals use, particularly the executives. So for instance, we know like in the 1970s, the training was sensitivity training because we were mostly seeing women returning to the work or coming to the workspace. So you had to be sensitive to their needs and to how they are going to be able to work in the workplace, but also take care of the home. Then it starts to become cultural competency instead of that sensitivity training. It needs to be a cultural competency. So something that is put in somebody's performance evaluation. It is on all of the committees that are like recruitment committees, meaning like there's a shared governance among individuals on that committee to have some kind of diverse candidate pool, as opposed to one person who serves as the diversity officer of that committee. So it depends if there is executive buy-in by looking at the language and the people who are considered like the diversity officer or the diversity office, and how they are, what influence they have over the executives level as well as the entire organization.
Absolutely. And now that we're talking about what it means to push back and to sustain momentum, Let me be very clear. I personally do not believe it is my responsibility to push back or sustain momentum for something that did not benefit my community. There have been marches, there have been rallies, and I'm so glad to see people kind of tap into their activism and their advocacy. I'm so glad to see people fighting for justice and taking to the streets and being vocal. I just don't necessarily believe it's the Black community's moment to lead this effort, because I believe that the communities who have benefited from the initiatives need to take the lead, right? And like we can't always be the ones in harm's way to advocate for other marginalized communities. However, for those of us who are now wanting DEI to continue because it is the right thing, no matter who it benefits, and wanting to push back, there are a couple of things that we can be asking, even in our organizations who are holding the line, to really determine, are they truly invested in equity? And we talked about data. And so we know that people lie, data and numbers don't lie. And so we want to make sure that we are documenting disparities, tracking progress, and using real metrics in our organization and in our companies to demonstrate that equity is a value of the organization. And one of the things, I'm going to stop here to get your feedback, is advocate for accountability. So if you as an individual, as a stakeholder, believe equity is important, how are you advocating for it? Are you willing to hold your leadership publicly accountable to their stated commitments? Now, both of you work for institutions like I do that are historically Black, Black-led, Black-run, Black-focused. But how do we hold accountable our leadership to stated commitments, or how would you suggest that those who are listening do that in their workplaces?
The first thing I would say is to not be reactive to anything, to really do a deep dive into your organization, as we've been talking about today, and see what is being cut, what is being removed, and then take an assessment there. And then from there, you then weigh how you want to strategically do this. In a day and time when there are attacks and there is fear, and I think fear is the way that this administration is using it so that people won't use their voices. But there is collective power in our unified voices. And
Mhm.
so, for individuals in their organization, this is the time for them to rally together, not as just one voice, but as a collective voice, finding other people who share in the removal of certain initiatives and form that alliance to be able to hold your leaders accountable. In this day and time, I would encourage everyone on the call to not just move. It takes one person to take the bold step to say, we need to do it, but be the type of leader in this advocacy work that also build coalition and partnerships with people, because there is power in numbers in this moment. And so really collectively bringing everybody to the table and advocating for those issues. But I would say don't be reactive to anything. Really take an analysis of what's happening. We saw that with the 1865 grant, right? That happened. That we were reactive, and very much so, right, to make sure that that funding got there. That funding is at historical Black colleges and land grant institutions now. We now have to figure out a strategic approach to making sure that those college presidents hold the line, right? And not just rely on the Congress and the senators to speak up, but what are they doing internally to hold the line collectively? But making sure that you are strategically doing that in a manner where you're building partnership. This is not the time for us to resist one another in our organization, but more so find common ground together.
What I
Absolutely.
was saying before, and I agree, like it needs to be that kind of shared governance. It doesn't need to come from one particular person or a specific office that is advising like the executive level, but it needs to be from all levels of the organization as well. And I would also caution organizations to not highlight data as far as we have X amount of Blacks and we have X amount,
Mhm.
because that just feeds into that misunderstanding that DEI is about quotas, and that's not what it is. Speak more on what the lived experience is, how it's benefited the organization, either monetarily or culturally, how there is diversity in thought as well, because that's also more so like that is, I don't want to say not a protected class, but that is something that moves the agenda forward, is thinking that there's difference in thought because there's difference in lived experience, but it's also based on like their race or their gender or their national origin or religion. So focus more on those issues as opposed to just matrix and data points, because it just feeds into that misconception that it's about quotas.
So there's a question for you all in the chat, and it is, do you believe it's achievable to operate as a moderate organization to reach more stakeholders? So kind of, tone it down a little bit to reach more while committing to these initiatives and this work? Or do you see those concepts as being in conflict with one another? Like, can you care about all of your stakeholders and do this work?
I think that you can, as long as you set the example that what you're saying is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So with starting with what it is to you, like I see some things in the chat, but I think that there's an image that is well known where there's individuals that are looking at
Baseball field.
like a baseball game.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's a soccer field or whatever. There's one person that is in a wheelchair. They give everybody a box. One person's tall, one person's short, one person in a wheelchair. The person in the wheelchair can't even use the box. The person that's short needs like more than one box, right? And the tall person didn't need a box in the first place. So setting the playing field, like leveling the playing field to understand, like have people understand what you mean when you're talking about DEI is important. And then to focus on, hey, we're trying to get the diversity in thoughts and the diversity in the lived experiences, and we're trying to look more like a salad, not a melting pot, and then be able to get people to buy in that way, as opposed to, and not to say don't use the terms DEI, but just to clarify what you mean when you're saying DEI.
Yeah. Dr. Mellon, you're on mute.
Oh, you're on mute, sir.
My apologies. I think it's an opportunity too for organizations to do a reset and to really show their stakeholders that, hey, we understand we're in some unprecedented times, but we want to bring all of our stakeholders to the table and start having think tanks and exchanging of ideas and start to try and meet their stakeholders in the middle, at least in this moment. I think when we see a lot of the kickback from organizations is because you didn't talk to any of us. You just made a unilateral decision to say we're rolling this back, and you put into my colleague's point, nobody's putting any parameters around defining what does it mean to roll back, right? What are you meaning to roll back? Some may say we're going to roll it back, but we're still going to fund all of our grants to 2028. And then some organizations like, well, these organizations still will benefit from it, putting some parameters around it. But I do think this is an opportunity for reset. People respect when you bring all of the diverse ideas to the table. And even if you agree to disagree, when you come to a middle place, you have a better way of gaining support and a better impact when you bring all those collective voices to the table. So I think organizations should use this time to reset, bring everybody to the table, find a medium ground, right? But also be very clear in defining what it is that you are trying to accomplish in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to my colleague's point, not removing automatically the words of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And if you come up with a better terminology that works for your stakeholders, it's okay, right? But really having those intentional conversations in this moment is really going to be something that I think you will see the success of it. So organizations who are having intentional conversations, they're going to thrive better in this environment than organizations who are leading from the top.
And I will say also, I heard one of our funders say, well, you might not want to use the word Black. And I'm thinking, well, not only does that devalue my humanity and who I am and how I show up, but that's not an option, right? And so what I will say as we navigate this discussion for all of you who are listening, most people had to have equity initiatives embedded in their workplace because they were not experts in what it meant to be inclusive. And so sometimes this work should not be done without a practitioner with expertise. So it's so interesting to me that people were so quick to slap a DEI label on a staff member or slap an initiative into their organization without expertise. And now they're so quick to roll it back the same way without expertise. Call in a practitioner, call in an ABC or another person who's doing this justice work so that they can help guide you along the way. If you need to change nomenclature, if you need to switch a couple of terms on your impact report or your website, that you can do that with the credibility of a professional who has the expertise to guide you in this work. But I think so many organizations and leaders are so hasty in just making moves without talking to anybody, without tapping into expertise, that they're making missteps. And so I want to add that too. Let's talk about people who are doing it right, because we don't have to necessarily figure this out on our own, because there are a lot of corporations who are doing this right. So often we're talking about the Target and the Lowe's and the Chick-fil-A's who are not doing the right thing. Nope, not doing the right thing. But
Ben
there
and
are
Jerry's.
organizations who are doing it right. And so many of those people have recommitted to their inclusion goals, even in the face of this sentiment. They have maintained transparency around hiring, retention. Most of them are even investing more into organizations like ours or others that care about accessibility or inclusion. They have not scaled back their advocacy. They are standing 10 toes down. And there's some risk involved in that. But that means that they were willing to lose a customer, to lose a supporter, to lose a stakeholder, to piss off a board member, to do what was right in this moment. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to do what's right and the risk that's inherent in doing that too.
I think also one of the things that we can pay attention to, if we use even for Costco's for an example, they just made a recommitment at first. They didn't define a lot. They didn't give us a lot of data at first. And they watched the public response. And then over time, they started to share their data and the initiatives and their commitment. But they literally just made a public commitment to say, you know what, we are recommitting ourselves to this and we're not rolling back anything. But the first couple of weeks, it wasn't a lot of data around it. When they saw the public response to it, you started to see them release information more and more and more, and their stocks and everything. It just skyrocketed, right? I also have been asking this question as I speak across the country, which is important. That what we do in this moment will define us for generations to come, and so to that end, we have to ask ourselves in 2025, what would the books of history say about us? Will they say that we stood on the side of what was right, what was just, what was the equitable thing to do? Or would it say that we bend the knee, right? And so I think as we see I always say the art of justice always been right. And so doing what's right sometime now could cost you something, but I do believe that you will benefit from it in the greater context of society, and people will remember you in this moment as someone who stood up. We talk about the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. because he stood for something. We talk about the late great Congressman John Lewis because as a teenager, he heard Dr. King on the radio and decided, I want to get in the civil rights movement. And he is now a legend because he found a way to get in the way and made some necessary noise. And so I think for all of the organizations, we have to ask ourselves, when the books of history speak about what we did in this moment, how do we want to be remembered?
I love that.
And just my favorite is Ben and Jerry's. Like they initially, when the first time the administration was in, and they had what was called the vices concepts for DEI, it wasn't as strong as the pushback now. But they basically were like, I don't care what you say, we're going to move forward. We are committed to diversity, and it has not hurt their pockets at all. So they are a complete test case for how to be firm in your way to keep moving with DEI. And for whatever reason, it's not affected them. And it's probably because they have diverse leadership at their head in their executive level, right? That's why.
So some common success factors for people who are going to sustain, hold the line: public accountability, leadership commitment. Is your leader, 10 toes down in making sure the work persists? Integration of equity into core business practices. And so it shouldn't be an add-on thing. It should be part of the culture of the organization. It should just be part of how we are, how we move, how we operate. And then this is the most important part: resilience in the face of external criticism. I was on a call with other nonprofit leaders, and one of the leaders was just, I think, feeling the angst of the moment and of the pushback of the freedoms and the loss of, the safety and all of that. And, the sentiment was like, oh my gosh, it's not safe. We're in danger. And I kept thinking, like, this work has never been safe. It's never been without harm or repercussion or consequence. It's never been easy. It's never been, but I think a lot of people who have enjoyed privilege take that for granted, right? And so now you are experiencing some of what, for decades, at least the Black community has faced: the lack of safety, the lack of freedom, the lack of of basic human rights around opportunity. And it's harsh to watch other communities face that. But a common success factor, if you're going to be committed to this work, is number one, stiffen your back and harden up, because you must be resilient in the face of external criticism. We may have to lose to win. And we've always known that. And some of these other communities are learning the hard way as they do this work. But I want to move into what we can do, what employers who are on can do, what you can do as members of the ecosystem, stakeholders, members of the workplace. First of all, you need to reaffirm that equity is a core value for you as an individual. I always say that sometimes we forget that we make up the workplaces, we make up the consumer base, we make up the organization. And so as you begin to kind of have that internal conversation with yourself of where you want to stand, decide if you're really willing to do the work of reaffirming that this is an imperative for you as an individual, and treat it as essential. What do you think about that, really quickly?
I
Absolutely.
agree.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I agree with that. I kind of am going to go a little bit off course, but organizations also need to make sure that they have vested resources for their equal employment opportunity offices as well. Like, we're talking about DEI, but and there's that pushback there, but there are significant pullbacks from the EEO language and from anti-discrimination laws. So it is important to also maintain that you have resources and the presence of your EEO officers internally, and support the external as well. So that would help, like, the whole picture of DEI and EEO.
Absolutely. I would say this, for organizations to really do an internal look at their organizations and to not allow fear to enter in. Fear is what is being used now to cause chaos. However, when we look at our organizations, the amount of federal funds we get, the amount of grants that we get, et cetera, the data shows for all community, for the Black community, is still not a lot of money. So in our organizations, we have to find it within ourselves to continue to do that work, to create that space. And in this day and time, we also can create a space where it's all organization space. And so now we're being reactive to what's happening, but there's a lot of organizations that we've never even heard about, but they're doing the work within their spaces, right? And so I think for me, the biggest advice for leaders on this call is to ignore the noise and do the work that you know that you should do. And that work doesn't always have to be public facing. Do the work that you know that you need to do. Don't cut back things that you don't have to cut back, because fear is being used to project and to stop progress. Ignore the noise. Don't allow fear to come in, and do the work.
Absolutely. Strengthen external partnerships. So we're talking about aligning with advocacy groups, justice organizations. You do not have to stand in this alone, right? There is support. And create safe spaces for dialogue. I tell this story how I worked for an organization. I was the only person of color in the office. And when Trayvon Martin was killed, the executive director sent out an email to everyone in the office and expressing sympathy, and then said, we all need to be concerned about Chrissy. It's probably very tough for her navigating this moment. And I remember thinking, like, why isn't everyone upset? Like, so don't just
Yeah.
create safe spaces for dialogue for people who you think are being directly affected, like the marginalized groups. Everyone needs to be part of the communication about how you all will make it through this moment. And so make sure that you're comprehensively addressing issues and knowing that for the first time ever, I think it's very apparent this is not just harming people of color or women or the LGBTQIA plus community or, any of these marginalized. It's harming immigrants. It's harming all of us at the same time. And so it will take all of us to fix this. But as we close, I want to give each of you the opportunity to give some closing remarks about what we discussed today, in hopes that you can encourage people to do a little bit better. And that's all we can ask in this moment. So we'll start the opposite way. We'll start with Ms. Berrien and close with Dr. Malone.
No, I know that we have been talking what seems to be not kind of negative, right? But I want us to think positive and stay that course. Don't remove things because of fear or pressure from an administration that does not look like the majority of Americans, right? And it is important to get with individuals and share ideas because we are probably fresh out of ideas of way of thinking of doing things. So it is important to have these kind of events or just cold call somebody to talk about what they're doing so that you can move this forward. Because I love what Dr. Malone was saying about what we're going to look like in the history books, right? Like if we bowed over or we kept on going and staying the course, because it does affect it affects Blacks, it affects minorities, it affects the disabled. I don't think that we talk much about as well, but there's so many other individuals that are affected by DEI. So it's not just Blacks and it's not a quota thing. Please, please, like if you learn one thing that I've said today, just it's not about a quota. So it's going on somebody's merits. But I digress.
Thank you so much. Dr. Malone?
I would just like to say that we are more alike than we are different, and we all should remember that at our core, we all want a better society, and that's why we're in this space and in this work. And do not allow fear to enter into your organizations and into you as an individual. And I always like to evoke the late Congressman John Lewis when he said that when you see something that is not right, that is not just, it is our moral obligation to find a way to get in the way and make some necessary noise for change. And so we all have to be the change that we want to see in our organizations, in our community, and in our world.
Thank you so much. And thank both of you for being on with us today. We appreciate your sharing, and thank all of you who were with us for today's Equity at Work. Next month, we will be back for a discussion on breaking barriers in career advancement for Black women. So I'm super excited to talk about that. And for Associated Black Charities, I am Chrissy Thornton. See you soon.
Take care, everybody.